They said the problem would remain unsolved for the next 200 years. They said it calmly, confidently, as if the future itself had already been examined and sealed. The professor stood at the podium, adjusting his glasses, his voice steady, his reputation unquestioned. Behind him, a whiteboard filled with symbols no one in the room dared to challenge anymore. Mathematics, he said, does not bend to hope. Some truths simply arrive too early for the human mind. The audience nodded. Students, professors, guests, all accepting the verdict. That's when a hand went up, not from the front row, not from a celebrated scholar, but from the side aisle, a black boy, standing. The room didn't react at first. Then someone noticed. Then everyone did. The professor stopped mid-sentence. "I'm sorry," he said, peering over his glasses. "This lecture is not a discussion." The boy didn't lower his hand. "I only need 1 minute," the boy said. A few people laughed, quietly at first, then louder. The professor smiled, not warmly, but politely, the way people do when they're already dismissing you. "And how old are you?" he asked. 15, the boy replied. The laughter spread across the hall. "This conjecture," the professor said, "has resisted the greatest mathematicians for over 2 centuries. Entire careers have been built and destroyed by it." He paused. "And you believe you've solved it?" The boy shook his head. "No," he said. "I think everyone's been asking the wrong question." The laughter stopped. 6 months earlier, no cameras, no audience, just the echo of footsteps in an empty hallway at Princeton. The boy's name was Marcus Ingram. Every night he waited near the East Wing until his mother finished her shift. She worked as a janitor, cleaning lecture halls long after the applause faded. Marcus didn't rush her. He sat on the floor with a notebook balanced on his knees, copying equations from chalkboards before they were erased. Symbols he didn't fully understand yet, but he would. Marcus didn't learn math from textbooks. He learned it from what others threw away. Half-erased formulas, discarded lecture notes, conversations professors assumed no one was listening to. To them, it was background noise. To Marcus, it was a language. Some nights he stayed so still that professors forgot he was there. They spoke freely, argued freely, admitted doubts they would never write in a paper. That's how Marcus first heard about the Goldstein conjecture, a problem so old that most believed it wasn't meant to be solved, only admired from a distance. Prime numbers, patterns that refused to behave, a claim that certain structures could never exist. Marcus went home and thought about one sentence he overheard. "Proving something doesn't exist," a professor had said, "is harder than finding it." That sentence stayed with him. Weeks passed, then months. Marcus filled notebooks, not with answers, but with questions. Why assume a pattern must be found? Why not prove that the search itself was flawed? One night, a security guard stopped him. "You can't sit here," the guard said. Marcus nodded, closed his notebook, and stood. But before leaving, he looked once more at the board, and saw it. Not a solution, a gap. Everyone was trying to force the conjecture into existing frameworks. Number theory, classical proofs, the same doors that had already been locked for 200 years. No one asked whether the door was the wrong one. Marcus went home and rewrote the conjecture in his own words, not as a challenge to be solved, but as a boundary to be defined. 6 months later, he stood in a packed lecture hall. The professor stared at him. "Sit down," the professor said. Marcus didn't. "I'm not claiming I solved it," Marcus said. "I'm saying the conjecture was never about finding a pattern. It was about proving the impossibility of one." A murmur spread across the room. The professor's smile faded. "You're suggesting that every mathematician before you misunderstood the problem?" he asked. "I'm suggesting," Marcus said, "that they were answering a question Goldstein never asked." Silence. The professor exhaled. This is not a place for fantasies, he said. Security, a voice interrupted. Wait! Another professor stood up, older, calmer. Let him finish, he said. The room held its breath. Marcus took a step forward. Prime numbers don't resist patterns, he said. They resist observation inside a single system. He paused. If you look from outside the system, the pattern isn't hidden. It's undefined. No one laughed now. Marcus felt his hands shake, but he didn't stop. Goldstein wasn't asking us to find something, he said. He was asking us to stop looking where it cannot exist. The professor at the podium stared at him. 10 minutes, he said coldly. Step up here and explain. Marcus walked toward the board. He knew one thing. He wasn't here to solve the problem. He was here to open a door no one had tried in 200 years. The chalk felt heavier than Marcus expected. Not because of its weight, but because of the room. Every eye was on him now, not curious, not kind, measuring. He wrote the conjecture's core statement on the board, exactly as it had been written for 2 centuries. Then he underlined one sentence. Twice. This line, Marcus said, is where everything went wrong. The professor folded his arms. Be precise, he said. Marcus nodded. Goldstein never claimed a pattern existed, he said. He asked whether such a structure could exist within conventional number theory. A few students leaned forward. Marcus continued. Everyone assumed the task was to find the structure, he said. So they searched endlessly. He turned back to the board and crossed out a word. Find. That assumption, Marcus said, was never proven. The professor laughed once, sharply. You're playing with semantics, he said. Mathematics isn't philosophy. Marcus didn't argue. Instead, he drew a simple diagram. 2 circles, one labeled number theory, the other labeled constraint space. For 200 years, Marcus said, you tried to force primes to confess inside one circle. He tapped the first. But Goldstein was asking whether the confession was even possible there. Silence. Someone in the audience whispered, Wait. Marcus went on. If a structure cannot exist under a system's axioms, he said, you don't prove that by searching forever. He looked up. You prove it by stepping outside the system. The older professor, the one who had spoken earlier, slowly stood. That's not standard, he said carefully. No, Marcus agreed, but it's necessary. The professor at the podium checked his watch. You have 3 minutes left, he said. Marcus nodded. He erased the circles and wrote a single sentence. What cannot be proven inside a system can sometimes be demonstrated outside it. My approach, Marcus said, doesn't solve the conjecture. Gasps. It reframes it, he continued. It defines the boundary Goldstein was pointing to. The professor frowned. You're saying the conjecture is true because the proof is impossible? He asked. No, Marcus said. I'm saying it's true because the search itself is invalid. The room was completely silent now. Marcus felt his throat tighten. For 200 years, he said, this problem defeated people not because it was too hard. He swallowed. But because it was asking them to stop. The professor stepped back from the podium. This is highly irregular, he said. The older professor didn't sit down. It's also... He paused, choosing his words. Interesting. Marcus lowered the chalk. I'm not asking you to accept this, he said quietly. I'm asking you to see the door. The professor stared at the board, at the erased assumptions, at the crossed-out word, find. You said you only needed 1 minute, the professor said. Marcus nodded. I lied, he said softly. A few people laughed, not mockingly this time. The professor exhaled. You'll submit whatever this is, he said, in writing. Marcus nodded again. And you'll understand, the professor added, that extraordinary claims require extraordinary scrutiny. Marcus met his eyes. I wouldn't have come here otherwise. The bell rang. The lecture was over, but no one moved. The room finally began to empty. Not loudly, not all at once. People left slowly, as if afraid that moving too fast would break whatever had just happened. Marcus stayed near the board, packing his notebook into his backpack. His hands were still shaking. He hadn't planned to speak that long. He hadn't planned to speak at all. He only knew one thing. If he sat down, the door would close again. Marcus. He turned. The older professor stood a few steps away. "My name is Professor Clark," he said. "Walk with me." They moved into the hallway. "I need to be very clear," Professor Clark said. "What you did in there was dangerous." Marcus nodded. "I know." "You challenged a senior faculty member in public," Clark continued. "You questioned a cornerstone problem. You embarrassed people with power." Marcus stopped. "I didn't mean to embarrass anyone," he said. "I meant to be honest." Professor Clark studied him for a long moment. "Where did you learn this?" he asked. Marcus hesitated. "Here," he said. "From listening." Clark smiled faintly. "That's what worries me." The next morning, Marcus was called back. Not to a lecture hall, to a conference room. 5 professors sat around a long table. The same professor from the podium sat at the center. His expression was unreadable. "You will be given 1 week," the professor said. 1 week to submit a written explanation of whatever it was you presented. Marcus felt his chest tighten. 1 week, the professor continued, under supervision, no outside assistance. Professor Clark raised an eyebrow. "That seems excessive," he said. "It's necessary," the professor replied. "If this boy wants to be taken seriously." Marcus spoke before he could stop himself. "I don't need special treatment," he said. "I just need time." The professor looked at him. "You'll have the time," he said, "and the pressure." That night, Marcus didn't sleep. He spread his notebooks across the kitchen table. Old pages, new ideas. The problem wasn't the math. It was the proof. How do you prove that a search is invalid? How do you formalize a boundary instead of a solution? 3 days in, something went wrong. Marcus noticed inconsistencies in the examples he'd built his framework on. They didn't fail completely. They failed subtly, enough to collapse the argument. He erased everything, started again. On the 5th day, he realized something worse. Some of the references he'd been given weren't neutral. They were traps, frameworks designed to force him back into the very system he was trying to escape. Marcus closed the book and stared at the ceiling. This wasn't about math anymore. It was about control. The night before the deadline, Marcus made a decision. He removed half his work, stripped it down. No decoration, no persuasion, just one claim, one door. The next morning, he walked back into Princeton and placed the paper on the table. Marcus placed the paper on the table and stepped back. No speech, no explanation, just pages. The professors didn't touch it at first. They skimmed the cover, checked the title, read his name. One of them sighed. "This isn't formatted correctly," someone said. Another flipped a page. "There's no traditional proof structure," a third added. Marcus stayed quiet. The professor who had challenged him in the lecture finally picked it up. He read slowly, too slowly. The room filled with the sound of pages turning and clocks ticking. 10 minutes passed, then 20. No one spoke. Marcus stared at the floor, counting his breaths. At some point, Professor Clark leaned forward. "Page 12, he said quietly. "Read that again." The senior professor frowned but obeyed. His expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. "This is unusual," he said. "It's not a proof," Marcus said. "It's a boundary argument." "Boundaries are philosophy," the professor replied. "Only when they're vague," Marcus said. "These are formal." Silence again. One professor cleared his throat. You're claiming that every attempted construction fails not by accident, he said, but by necessity. Yes, Marcus answered. And you're saying this necessity can be demonstrated without constructing the object itself? Yes. The professor leaned back. That's dangerous, he said. Professor Clark smiled faintly. So was Gödel. The name hung in the air. The meeting ended without a verdict. No praise, no rejection, just a decision. You'll present this, the professor said, in public. Marcus felt his stomach drop. In 1 week, the professor continued, with no edits. Professor Clark objected. He's 15, he said. The professor didn't look at him. He raised his hand. He replied. The days that followed blurred together. Marcus lived inside his notes, not expanding them, testing them, every line, every assumption. He searched for contradictions, hoping to find one before someone else did. 2 days before the presentation, disaster struck. His printer jammed, then failed completely. Marcus stared at the half-printed document. A crucial section was missing, the heart of the argument. Lemma 9. He tried again. Nothing. That night, Marcus sat alone, rewriting from memory, not copying, reconstructing. Goldstein's words echoed in his head. What cannot be proven can sometimes be demonstrated. Marcus realized something. Lemma 9 wasn't a statement. It was a demonstration. And demonstrations didn't belong on paper. They belonged on a board. The day of the presentation arrived. The hall was fuller than before. Whispers followed Marcus as he walked to the front. The professor nodded at him. You may begin. Marcus picked up the chalk. He didn't look at his notes. He didn't look at the audience. He drew the boundary. Word count, 1,120 words. Estimated duration, 11 labs atom, speed 1.0. Approximately 5 minutes 10 seconds. Дальше идет 2А. Публичная презентация, давление, начало перелома. Готов. Пиши. Кидай 2А. Заново сделай 1. Вна 8 минут. Принял, братан. Переделываю парт 1. Взаново, цель, реальные примерно 8 минут под 11 laps. Адам, speed 1.0. Даю чистый текст без пояснений, копипаст сразу в озвучку. Part 1V, the week before the fall. Marcus placed the paper on the table and stepped back. No speech, no defense, no explanation, just pages. The professors didn't touch it immediately. They looked at the cover first, then at each other, then back at the name printed on top. Marcus Ingram. One of them sighed. This isn't formatted correctly, a professor muttered. Another flipped through the pages, faster than the first. There's no standard proof structure, he said. No classical buildup. Marcus stayed silent. The senior professor, the one who had humiliated him during the lecture, finally reached out and took the paper. He read slowly, too slowly. The room filled with the sound of pages turning. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat. 5 minutes passed, then 10. No one spoke. Professor Clark leaned forward. Page 11, he said quietly. Read that part again. The senior professor frowned but returned to the page. His brow tightened. This is unconventional, he said. It's not a solution, Marcus said calmly. It's a boundary. You're redefining the problem, another professor said. No, Marcus replied. I'm restoring it. The professor scoffed. For 200 years, he said, mathematicians tried to find a structure. You're saying they should have stopped looking. Yes, Marcus answered, because the search itself violates the conjecture's premise. Silence. One professor leaned back in his chair. You're claiming impossibility, he said, but without contradiction. Yes. That's not how proofs work, the professor snapped. Marcus took a breath. That's how limits work. Professor Clark smiled faintly. So you're arguing that the conjecture defines a boundary condition, Clark said, not an object. Marcus nodded. And that boundary, Clark continued, exists regardless of whether we ever cross it. Yes. The senior professor closed the document. This is dangerous thinking, he said. Gödel was dangerous, Clark replied calmly. The name landed heavily in the room. The meeting ended without applause. No congratulations. No rejection. Just a decision. You will present this, the senior professor said. Publicly. Marcus felt his stomach drop. In 1 week, the professor continued, in front of the department. No edits, no revisions. Professor Clark stood. He's 15, he said. This pressure is unnecessary. The professor didn't look at him. He raised his hand, he replied. He wanted to be heard. That week felt longer than any year Marcus had lived. He didn't expand the work. He attacked it. Every sentence, every symbol. He tried to break it. If it could fail, he wanted it to fail in his room, not on the board. He slept on the floor beside his notes, ate when he remembered, ignored his phone. On the 4th night, he found a problem. Not a small one. A structural weakness. A missing step. Lemma 9. Without it, the argument collapsed. Marcus rewrote it 3 times. Each version failed. On the 6th day, something felt off. He rechecked the references he'd been encouraged to use. They weren't neutral. They subtly forced the argument back into classical number theory, frameworks designed to absorb and dissolve his idea. It wasn't academic caution, it was containment. Marcus closed the book. This wasn't about truth, it was about control. That night, the printer failed. First a jam, then silence. He stared at the half-printed document. Lemma 9 was missing. The core, the heart. Marcus sat on the floor, surrounded by papers. And then he remembered something. Goldstein's original lecture. A sentence no one ever quoted. What cannot be proven, Goldstein had said, can sometimes be demonstrated. Lemma 9 wasn't meant to be written. It wasn't a statement. It was a demonstration. And demonstrations don't live on paper. They live in space, on boards, in motion, in logic unfolding in real time. The morning of the presentation arrived. The hall was full, more than before. Word had spread. Marcus stood at the front, chalk in his hand. The senior professor watched him carefully. You may begin, he said. Marcus didn't look at the audience. He drew a line, not a number, a boundary. Marcus stood still for a moment. Not because he was afraid, but because the room was louder than silence. Whispers crawled across the hall, not mocking, not friendly, curious. The chalk felt dry in his fingers. He turned to the board and began. I'm not here to solve the Goldstein conjecture, Marcus said. I'm here to explain why it was never meant to be solved the way we tried. A murmur rolled through the audience. The senior professor crossed his arms. You have exactly 40 minutes, he said. Marcus nodded. He drew a simple line across the board. This line, he said, represents the limits of classical number theory. He paused. For 200 years, every attempt to solve Goldstein stayed on one side of this line. He drew dots, clusters, arrows. All failed constructions share one thing, Marcus continued. They assume the structure must exist somewhere inside this space. He turned to face the audience. But Goldstein's conjecture never asked where the structure was. He tapped the board. It asked whether such a structure could exist at all, under these rules. The older professor in the back leaned forward. Marcus erased half the board. Gasps. You don't prove impossibility by searching forever, Marcus said. You prove it by showing that the search violates the rules that define the space. He began writing again, slowly, deliberately. A new framework emerged, not numbers, constraints. This is not number theory, Marcus said. This is a constraint space. The senior professor stepped forward. You're inventing terminology, he snapped. This isn't recognized mathematics. Marcus didn't look at him. Neither was calculus, he said quietly. until it was necessary. A ripple moved through the room. Marcus continued. If a structure existed, he said, it would have to satisfy all these constraints simultaneously. He circled a region on the board. But this region is empty. Someone whispered, "He's showing it." Marcus underlined a statement. Not because we failed to find the structure, he said, but because the constraints eliminate the possibility. The senior professor shook his head. You're claiming emptiness without enumeration, he said. Yes, Marcus replied, because enumeration is invalid here. He turned and wrote one sentence large enough for the back row to see. Absence caused by contradiction is different from absence caused by limits. The room was completely silent now. Marcus felt time stretch. Goldstein didn't fail, he said. He succeeded. The senior professor laughed once. That's convenient, he said. You're redefining success. No, Marcus said. I'm defining intention. A hand went up in the audience, a graduate student. If this boundary exists, she asked, why didn't anyone see it before? Marcus hesitated, then answered honestly. Because it requires letting go of the idea that every question must have an object as an answer. He looked around the room. And that's uncomfortable. The senior professor glanced at the clock. 30 minutes remain, he said. Marcus nodded. I haven't reached Lemma 9 yet, he said. The professor froze. Lemma 9 was missing from your submission, he said sharply. Marcus took a breath. I know. A ripple of tension spread. It was never meant to be printed, Marcus said. It can't be. The professor stepped closer. Then what exactly are you presenting? He demanded. Marcus turned back to the board. A demonstration, he said. He erased everything. The room gasped again. He drew one shape, a boundary enclosing nothing. This, Marcus said, is Lemma 9. The senior professor opened his mouth, then stopped. Marcus continued. If you assume existence, the system collapses. If you assume non-existence, the system remains consistent. He stepped aside. The conjecture doesn't ask us to find a structure, he said. It asks us to recognize a limit. Silence. Heavy. Uncomfortable. The senior professor finally spoke. This is highly unconventional, he said. Professor Clark stood. So was every breakthrough that mattered, he said. Marcus looked at the board. He had 20 minutes left, and everything was about to break open. The first question didn't come from the senior professor. It came from the back of the room. A man Marcus had never seen before stood up slowly. Gray hair, no expression. Your boundary, he said, depends on an assumption of completeness. Marcus nodded. Yes. And if the system is incomplete? The man continued. Marcus didn't answer immediately. That's exactly the point, he said. If the system is incomplete, then searching for the structure inside it is meaningless. A murmur spread. The man sat down. Another hand rose, a woman near the front. You're arguing for non-existence without exhaustion, she said. How do you justify certainty? Marcus took a breath. I don't, he said. I justify necessity. The senior professor leaned forward. That's wordplay, he said. Mathematics demands rigor, not poetry. Marcus looked at him. Rigor is knowing when a tool no longer applies, he said, not using it until it breaks. The room shifted. Someone coughed. Someone laughed nervously. The senior professor stood. For 200 years, he said, this conjecture resisted the greatest minds alive. And you expect us to believe a teenager reframed it in a hallway? Marcus felt the pressure hit his chest. He could feel his pulse in his ears. I don't expect belief, he said. I expect inspection. The senior professor smiled thinly. Very well, he said. Let's inspect. He walked to the board and pointed. You claim this region is empty, he said. Show us the contradiction. Marcus stepped forward. If the structure exists, he said, it must satisfy constraint A. He wrote it. And constraint B. Another line. And constraint C. The board filled. If all three are true simultaneously, Marcus continued, then this implication follows. He paused. But that implication violates the axioms that define primes. The senior professor frowned. You're stacking assumptions, he said. No, Marcus replied. I'm exposing incompatibility. Professor Clark stood again. This is equivalent to a proof by inconsistency, he said, except the inconsistency is structural, not numerical. The senior professor turned on him. That's not accepted language. Neither was incompleteness, Clark replied. The room went quiet again. Another professor spoke. If this boundary is real, she said, why does it feel so simple? Marcus hesitated, then answered softly. Because we were trained to look for complexity, he said, not limits. The senior professor checked his watch. 10 minutes, he said. Marcus nodded. He erased one small part of the board. That, he said, is the mistake everyone makes. He pointed to the erased space. They try to fill it. He stepped back. You don't solve this conjecture, Marcus said. You accept it. The senior professor stared at the board for a long time. Finally, he spoke. You're asking us to admit we were wrong, he said. Marcus shook his head. No, he said. I'm asking you to admit the question was right. The room felt heavier now, not hostile, exposed. A young researcher raised her hand. If this holds, she said, what happens next? Marcus looked around the hall. Then this conjecture stops being a wall, he said, and becomes a map. The senior professor slowly returned to his seat. The questions stopped, not because they were answered, but because no one knew how to ask the next one. Marcus set the chalk down. He realized his hands were no longer shaking. The board didn't lie, and the room knew it. The silence lasted longer than Marcus expected. Not the awkward kind, not the confused kind, the dangerous kind. The senior professor leaned back in his chair, fingers pressed together, eyes fixed on the board as if it might suddenly contradict itself. It didn't. One by one, the other professors began to speak, not loudly, not confidently, but carefully. As a boundary argument, one said, this is internally consistent. Another nodded slowly. It doesn't violate known results, she added. It avoids them. The senior professor finally looked at Marcus. You're not claiming finality, he said. You're claiming direction. Yes, Marcus replied. A way forward. Professor Clark stood again. What he's presented, Clark said, is not a completed proof in the classical sense. The senior professor seized on that. Exactly, he said, which means, it's something rarer, Clark continued. It's a framework. The word landed differently this time. Frameworks didn't get dismissed easily. They got examined, expanded, built upon. The senior professor stood and walked to the board. He didn't erase anything. Instead, he stared at the boundary Marcus had drawn. You realize, he said slowly, that if this holds, it doesn't just affect Goldstein. Marcus nodded. It affects every conjecture built on similar assumptions, he said. A ripple moved through the room. That wasn't a teenager speaking. That was someone who understood consequences. The senior professor turned. You understand what you're implying? He asked. Marcus swallowed. Yes, he said. And I understand why that's uncomfortable. The professor studied him for a long time. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. Not dismissively, not kindly, respectfully. You didn't come here to win, he said. You came here to change the rules. Marcus didn't answer, because it was true. The panel called a recess. People stood in clusters whispering urgently. Marcus stayed where he was. Professor Clark approached him quietly. "You did something very few people ever do," Clark said. "What's that?" Marcus asked. "You made them unsure." The senior professor returned with the others. The room settled. "This panel," he said, "will not issue a verdict today." Marcus felt his chest tighten. "However," the professor continued, "we acknowledge that what has been presented cannot be dismissed." A pause. "We request a full written expansion," he said, "with time." Professor Clark smiled. "How much time?" he asked. The senior professor hesitated. 3 months, he said, "with institutional oversight." Marcus looked up. "May I ask something?" he said. The professor nodded. "If the expansion confirms this boundary," Marcus asked, "what happens to Goldstein?" The professor exhaled. "Then," he said, "Goldstein stops being an unsolved problem." He paused. "And becomes a defined limit." The room felt lighter, not triumphant, honest. As people began to leave, the senior professor stopped Marcus. "You embarrassed me," he said quietly. Marcus froze. "But," the professor continued, "you also reminded me why I became a mathematician." He extended his hand. Marcus shook it. Outside, the sky was already dark. Marcus found his mother waiting near the steps. She looked tired. "How did it go?" she asked. Marcus smiled. "They listened," he said. She hugged him, and for the first time since he raised his hand, the world felt open. 3 months. That sounded generous to anyone who didn't understand what it meant. To Marcus, it sounded like a countdown. Princeton gave him a small room in an old building behind the main hall, a desk, a chair, a whiteboard that still smelled like disinfectant, and rules. He could work there, under observation. He could request books, but every request was logged. He could use a computer, but the internet was restricted. He could not speak to outside researchers. "No outside assistance," the senior professor reminded him on the first day. "If your framework is real, it will survive alone." Marcus nodded. He didn't argue, because he already knew what they were doing. They weren't just testing the math. They were testing him. Every morning, Marcus arrived before sunrise. The campus was quiet then, snow crunching under shoes, street lamps glowing like tired stars. He would unlock the room, sit down, and open his notes. For the first hour, he didn't write anything. He read. Every line he'd already written. Every assumption he'd already made. Looking for weakness. Because Princeton wasn't a place that tolerated weakness. On the second week, the first pressure came. A professor entered his room without knocking. Not Professor Clark. Someone else. Younger. Sharper. "I've been assigned to monitor your progress," the professor said, "and to ensure academic standards are met." Marcus nodded, trying to stay calm. The professor walked to the board and pointed at Marcus's boundary diagram. "You're leaning heavily on constraint mapping," he said. "Show me where you formalize it." Marcus wrote a definition. The professor watched, expression neutral. "That's not formal enough," he said. Marcus tightened his grip on the marker. "What would make it formal?" he asked. The professor shrugged. "Accepted language," he said. "Accepted structure." Then he left. Marcus stared at the board after the door closed. Accepted. That word followed him like a shadow. By the end of the month, Marcus realized something. They weren't demanding rigor. They were demanding obedience. He began rewriting his framework in 2 versions. One version in his own language, clear, sharp, honest. Another version in their language, cautious, familiar, safe. The second version felt like wearing someone else's clothes, tight in the wrong places. But it moved. At night, he went home to a small apartment on the edge of town. His mother slept during the day and worked at night. They passed each other like ghosts. Sometimes she left food on the table, rice, chicken, bread. Sometimes Marcus forgot to eat it. One night she found him at the table, staring at a single page for an hour. "Marcus," she said softly, "are you okay?" He looked up. "I don't know," he admitted. She sat across from him. "You're doing this for you," she said. "Not for them." Marcus nodded, but his eyes stayed tired. "They don't want me to win," he said. "They want me to disappear." His mother reached out and held his hand. "Then don't disappear," she said. The next morning, Marcus returned to the small room and found a new folder on his desk. No name, no signature. Inside were printed notes, critiques, questions, and one page of suggested references. Marcus read them twice, then 3 times. They weren't neutral. They were traps. Every reference subtly forced his framework back into classical number theory. Every question pulled him toward the same old doors. Marcus sat very still. He felt the anger rise slowly, like heat under ice. He wanted to tear the papers apart. Instead, he did something else. He started building a firewall, a section of his work dedicated to identifying containment tactics, not accusing anyone, just proving formally why certain routes were invalid. If they tried to drag him back, he would show the rope. By the middle of the second month, his whiteboard was full every day. Definitions, operators, mappings. He began calling his method a dual-space operator, not because it sounded impressive, because it was true. 2 spaces, one inside the system, one outside. He didn't search for primes. He searched for constraints that described why primes refused the structure. And slowly, something began to happen. The framework stopped feeling fragile. It started to feel inevitable. On the final week, Professor Clark visited. He didn't bring pressure. He brought a look, one that said, "Be careful." "I heard they're tightening the panel," Clark said quietly. Marcus nodded. "I know." Clark glanced at the board. "You've gone deeper," he said. "I had to," Marcus replied. Clark leaned in. "Marcus," he said, "they will try to break you at the end." Marcus didn't answer immediately. Then he said it. "Then I'll make it unbreakable." The final week arrived without ceremony. No announcement, no warning, just a quiet shift in the air. Marcus felt it the moment he walked into the room. The whiteboard had been cleaned. Not erased, cleaned. Every line gone, every diagram wiped away. For a second, Marcus just stood there. Then he understood. They weren't sabotaging his work. They were reminding him who owned the space. He didn't panic. He rewrote everything from memory, not word for word. Better. By noon, the board was full again, clearer, tighter, sharper. That afternoon, an email arrived. Subject line, final review session time, tomorrow, 9 a.m. location, main hall. No details, no agenda. Marcus read it 3 times. That night, he didn't go home. He stayed in the room long after the lights outside went dark. He sat on the floor with his back against the wall, notebooks spread around him like armor. He reviewed Lemma 9 again. Not the statement, the logic behind it. Because if they attacked anything, it would be that. At 2:17 a.m., someone knocked. Marcus froze. The door opened slowly. It wasn't security. It was the younger professor, the one assigned to monitor him. "You should go home," the professor said. "You'll need rest." Marcus looked up. "I'm fine," he said. The professor stepped inside and closed the door. "I'm not here officially," he said. "I'm doing you a favor." Marcus stayed silent. "The panel has concerns," the professor continued. "Serious ones." "What kind?" Marcus asked. The professor hesitated. "They think your framework collapses without Lemma 9 being written formally." Marcus felt his chest tighten. "It can't be," he said. "That's the point." "I know," the professor replied. "But they don't want demonstrations. They want text." Marcus stood. "So what are you saying?" he asked. The professor met his eyes. "If Lemma 9 isn't on paper tomorrow," he said, They'll say your work is incomplete. Marcus felt something crack. That's dishonest, he said. The professor looked away. Welcome to institutions, he said. Then he left. Marcus sat back down slowly. He understood the trap now. If he wrote Lemma 9 formally, he would destroy its meaning. If he didn't, they would destroy his credibility. Either way, he would lose. Unless... Marcus opened a fresh notebook. He didn't try to write Lemma 9. He wrote around it. He built a logical corridor so narrow that Lemma 9 became unavoidable, not stated, forced. By sunrise, his eyes burned and his hands shook, but he smiled. At 8:45 a.m., the hall was already full, more than before. The senior professor sat at the center of the panel, expression unreadable. Marcus took his place at the board. You may begin, the professor said. Marcus nodded. I'll be brief, he said. A few eyebrows rose. He rebuilt the framework from scratch. Faster this time. Cleaner. No wasted motion. The room followed. Then he stopped. Right before Lemma 9. You'll notice, Marcus said, that if all previous constraints hold, he turned to the board. Then only one outcome remains. He stepped aside. And that outcome, he said, cannot be written without contradiction. The senior professor leaned forward. So you refuse to complete the proof? He asked. Marcus met his gaze. No, he said. I refuse to falsify it. Silence. A long one. Professor Clark stood. He's correct, Clark said. If Lemma 9 is written, it ceases to be true. The senior professor closed his eyes briefly. For the first time, Marcus saw doubt cross his face. The board stood untouched, and everyone in the room knew it. The silence that followed was not confusion. It was calculation. The senior professor leaned back, fingers interlocked, eyes fixed not on Marcus, but on the board, as if the board had betrayed him. You're asking us, he said slowly, to accept a proof that cannot be written. Marcus didn't answer right away. He knew this moment mattered. I'm asking you, Marcus said, to accept a proof that cannot be forced. A ripple moved through the room. One of the panel members cleared her throat. He's correct, she said. There are precedents, demonstrative limits, meta-proofs. The senior professor turned sharply. This is not philosophy, he said. This is mathematics. And mathematics, she replied calmly, has survived every time it admitted its own limits. The senior professor stood. He walked to the board for the first time that morning. He stared at the final line Marcus had written, the unavoidable gap where Lemma 9 had to exist. You know what you're doing, he said without turning around. Marcus nodded. Yes. You're forcing us to choose, the professor continued, between rejecting your work or admitting we designed the wrong test. Marcus said nothing, because it was true. The professor turned. When you submitted your original paper, he said, you were given references. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. Yes, he said. Those references, the professor continued, were intended to help you formalize your work. Marcus met his gaze. They were intended to contain it, he said. A sharp intake of breath spread through the hall. The senior professor didn't deny it. Every institution, he said, protects its foundations. Marcus took a step forward. Then don't pretend this was about rigor, he said. Pretend it was about fear. The room froze. Professor Clark stood. He's right, Clark said quietly. We didn't just test his math. We tested his compliance. The senior professor closed his eyes. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then he opened them. You've put us in an impossible position, he said to Marcus. Marcus shook his head. No, he said. I showed you one that already existed. A vote was called, not formally, not ceremonially. Hands raised slowly. 1, 2, 3. Enough. The senior professor exhaled. This panel acknowledges, he said, voice tight, that the boundary argument stands. Marcus felt his knees weaken. Furthermore, the professor continued, we acknowledge that the evaluation process was flawed. The word was small, but it mattered. You will be granted independent status, he said, time, resources, and the right to publish without alteration. A pause. And Professor Clark will oversee the process. Clark nodded once. The room began to move again. Whispers, stunned looks. The senior professor approached Marcus one last time. You didn't win, he said quietly. You survived. Marcus looked at the board. No, he said. I changed it. Outside, cameras waited. But Marcus didn't stop. He walked past them, down the steps, toward the street, where his mother stood, holding her coat tight against the cold. She looked at his face and knew. Did you do it? She asked. Marcus smiled. They couldn't erase it, he said. She hugged him. And somewhere inside Princeton, a door that had been locked for 200 years was no longer closed. The paper went live on a Tuesday morning. No announcement, no press release, just a quiet upload to an academic archive that most people never checked unless something was wrong. Within an hour, something was. Emails started arriving before Marcus even woke up. Not congratulations, questions, then objections, then disbelief. By noon, the servers slowed. By evening, the comment threads were on fire. Mathematicians argued over the title before they reached the abstract. Some dismissed it immediately, others read it twice, a few read it 10 times. What unsettled them wasn't what Marcus claimed, it was what he didn't claim. There was no grand solution, no triumphant theorem, just a carefully drawn boundary, and a quiet accusation that 2 centuries of effort had been misdirected. Blogs picked it up first, then academic Twitter, then mainstream science media. 15-year-old challenges Goldstein conjecture, new framework, questions 200 years of assumptions. Is this the end of a legendary problem? The senior professor watched it all unfold from his office. He didn't speak publicly, not at first, but people noticed something else. His previous papers began resurfacing. Old footnotes, dismissed approaches, language that now sounded convenient. Someone posted a comparison, side-by-side excerpts. It spread fast. Marcus was called into Princeton that afternoon, not to be questioned, to be warned. This is becoming political, an administrator said. You should stay quiet. Marcus nodded. He had already learned that lesson. But silence didn't stop the calls. Universities reached out quietly at first, then less quietly. Invitations, requests, offers to collaborate. Marcus declined most of them. He wasn't finished. Then the senior professor released a statement, short, carefully worded. He praised Marcus's intelligence, acknowledged the novelty of the framework, and subtly questioned the conclusions. It is premature, the statement said, to draw final boundaries around problems of such depth. Marcus read it once, then closed the page, because the attack wasn't in the words, it was in the timing. Within hours, an anonymous critique appeared online, lengthy, technical, and familiar. Marcus recognized the language immediately, the same containment tactics, the same forced assumptions, this time in public. Professor Clark called him that night. They're trying to drown you in rigor, Clark said. Classic move. Marcus stared at his notes. Then I'll let the boundary speak, he said. The next morning, Marcus posted a response. Not defensive, not angry, a single document, shorter than the critique. He didn't argue, he mapped. Every objection was placed inside the constraint space, every criticism shown to rely on assumptions already invalidated. No insults, no accusations, just clarity. By the end of the day, the tone shifted. Not acceptance, respect. A week later, something unprecedented happened. A journal didn't ask for revisions. They asked for context. "How should this be taught?" the editor wrote. "What does this change?" Marcus took a long time to answer. He finally wrote, "It teaches us where to stop looking and where to start thinking." The senior professor read that line, and for the first time, he understood what Marcus had taken from him. 3 months later, the noise finally softened. Not because every question had been answered, not because everyone suddenly agreed, but because the direction was clear. Arguments still existed, disagreements still burned quietly in academic halls, but something fundamental had shifted. Marcus's framework had entered the language. Not loudly, not triumphantly, quietly. At first, it appeared as a sentence buried deep in a paper, then a cautious footnote, then a question at the end of a lecture that made the room pause. And slowly, something changed. Professors stopped asking how to solve Goldstein. They started asking what it meant. That shift mattered more than any headline, because questions about meaning don't disappear. They don't expire. They reshape everything around them. The journal publication followed without drama. No press conference, no applause. Just a line at the very end of the paper. "The Goldstein conjecture is hereby reclassified as a boundary result, pending further exploration." 200 years of effort. 200 years of brilliant minds trying to break through a wall. And the wall wasn't shattered. It was understood. The door wasn't kicked down. It was left open. That detail mattered, because open doors invite others to walk through. The senior professor resigned shortly after, not publicly disgraced, not dragged through headlines, just finished. His office was emptied quietly, books boxed, awards taken down. Most people never noticed, but Marcus did. A letter arrived one morning, handwritten, addressed to him. It was short, no excuses, no defenses. "I spent my life guarding a question," it read. "You reminded me why it was asked." Marcus read it once. He didn't smile. He didn't feel victorious. He folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his notebook. Not as a trophy, as a reminder. Offers came in waves after that. Scholarships from places Marcus had only read about. Institutes eager to associate their names with his work. Private mentors offering guidance, resources, influence. Marcus listened, and declined most of them, because one offer mattered more than the rest. Princeton offered his mother a permanent position, not cleaning halls late at night, managing them, a desk, a nameplate, a place that acknowledged what had always been true. She had belonged there all along. Months later, Marcus stood on the stage of his old high school. The lights were warm, the room familiar. He looked out and saw faces that reminded him of himself. Quiet students, curious students, students who had learned early not to raise their hands. "They told me some questions weren't meant for people like us," Marcus said. The room leaned in. "They said some doors were already closed," he continued. "That some problems were too old, too big, too guarded." He paused. "But questions don't belong to institutions," he said. "They don't belong to titles or buildings or history. They belong to anyone brave enough to raise a hand." The room stayed silent, not because they were confused, because they understood. "And sometimes," Marcus added softly, "the answer isn't on the board. It's the space where everyone else stopped looking." That night, Marcus and his mother walked home together. No cameras, no interviews, just city lights reflected on wet pavement. "Are you happy?" she asked. Marcus thought for a moment. Not about fame, not about recognition. "Yes," he said, "because they listened." She smiled, and somewhere, in a lecture hall, a notebook, a mind just beginning to doubt, a hand was raised. This story was never about mathematics. Not really. Math was just the language. The real story was about who gets permission to speak, about who is allowed to question things that have been accepted for too long. Marcus didn't defeat a conjecture. He faced a system that rewards obedience more than curiosity, that respects credentials more than insight, that often confuses authority with truth. And he didn't break that system by shouting. He broke it by standing still, by refusing to sit down when silence was expected, by asking a question no one wanted to hear. This is how progress actually happens, not in explosions, not in revolutions, but in moments where someone notices that everyone else is walking in the same direction and dares to stop. What made Marcus dangerous wasn't his intelligence, it was his independence. He didn't need permission to think. He didn't wait to be invited. He raised his hand, and when the door opened, even slightly, he didn't rush through. He held it open for others, because every system has boundaries, and every boundary is an invitation to ask why it exists, an invitation to imagine what lies beyond it. Some people will spend their entire lives protecting doors. Others will spend their lives walking through them. And a rare few will remind us that doors were never meant to be guarded, only opened. So if you've ever been told that a question isn't meant for you, if you've ever felt out of place for wondering too much, remember this. The next time you hesitate to raise your hand, that hesitation might be the very reason you should.